So we've got a literal translation, but it's hardly what we might call a poem. So we're going to need to do a bit more work on it. Let's think now about what it is that makes it a poem, what makes it Rilke's poem enjoyable to hear, and what makes it thought-provoking. Well, let's think about the themes. For such a short poem, there's really a lot going on. And just from this idea of the roses, we move into lots of abstract ideas and sort of emotions in here. So we're looking at what's inside, what's outside. We've got this contrast between suffering, or pain, and soft, smooth, comforting linen. We've got contrast between the big and small, the great heavens or skies and the small roses. The roses are sorglos, carefree, relaxed, seemingly unaware of the risk posed to them by eine zitternde Hand, by a passing human. We've got this movement in the second half of the poem into a slightly sort of abstract, dreamy state. The flowers ließen sich überfüllen. We've got this flowing and overflowing sort of motion here. And we move from, at the same time, we move from the idea of the roses being often open to talking about time, and the days sich schließen, they close, follow and follow, or they end perhaps. So here in the second part, we really move from the roses to talking about time, moving into this abstract realm where time in Sommer becomes a room. So we're sort of moving back and forth between one thing and another. Now we might, in our translation, be able to capture most of this sense, but perhaps not every single metaphor or image exactly as it appears, because we've also got to think about the rhythm and the rhyme in the poem. If we talk about the pace to it, well, there's no fixed meter or beat. It's not so rigid as a classical poem. It hasn't got a fixed number of syllables per line. We start with sort of shorter sentences or questions at the beginning and then go longer in the sentences. But we've got this break halfway through, and this full stop really makes us pause on that word and think, is that carrying an extra emphasis? What about the rhymes? Well, there's lots going on, lots of alliteration and assonance in this poem. We've got this clear in and really drilling in the idea of what's within. After all, that's the title of the poem too, Das Rosen Innere. We've got lots of long O's, Rosen, Rosen, Sorglosen, Lose, im Losen. Then in the second half of the poem, we've got a different set of sounds: kaum, Raum, Traum, and ließen, fließen, schließen. We've also got a sort of partial rhyme between Sommer and Zimmer and immer. But what really stands out to me reading it and hearing the poem is this middle line, eine zitternde Hand sie verschütten. We've got harder sounds there, t, and d, which don't really appear anywhere else in the poem. So that line really stands out to me, and it forms a sort of break between the top half and the bottom half. So if we look at the colour in the poem, we can see that there's a clear structure here. We've got rhymes that appear in the first half of the poem, which then don't appear later. Now it seems to me that Rilke is quite influenced by the sonnet form, but this isn't quite a traditional sonnet. In German, the sonnet would normally go A, B, B, A in terms of the rhymes, so that might be innen, we, sie, innen. But we've not got quite that pattern, although we do have this sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 parts to the poem. So it might be, we might presume that Rilke had this structure in mind, so but we might want to echo that as much as possible in our poem, as far as English rhymes allow. It's worth noting that the rhymes aren't just at the end of the lines. There's also this rhyme within a word, within the line, Binnensee. So although we've got that sort of underlying sonnet structure, perhaps it's much more playful and less rigid than that. And when we come to try and find rhymes, we might bear in mind that it's not just rhymes, but also a lot of alliteration. We've got lots of s and l and r sounds, Rosen, laws and Spiegel, and lots of similar sounds which might work instead of a rhyme, I suppose. And yet we've got this line that stands out for having quite different sounds in it. When we translate anything, not just a poem, it's worth considering what our priority is. What's our goal or reason for translating? Of course, we want to translate this poem to impress the judges of the Stephen Spender Prize. But what is going to direct us in terms of our choices? Is our main reason for translating this to help readers understand the meaning of the German? Do we want to convey all of the images and metaphors exactly as they are in the German? For example, linen. Do we want to use the word linen, even though that's actually quite a difficult word to rhyme in English? There aren't many words that rhyme with it. Or do we want to push in another direction to try and create the similar sound effects, the rhymes, to have lots of ooh, long sounds, and the alliteration, the consonants repeating? Or do we want to perhaps to think about the structure, about the build-up of that long sentence and then that jarring sentence in the middle? Is the syntax of the German important? Now, we have to bear in mind that German syntax, the structure of a sentence, has to be different to English because the verb goes to the end in German. So we're going to have to make compromises in places. But it seems to me a sort of central goal when we try to translate a poem is to achieve the same emotional effect. And that effect is made up of all of those points of the triangle. So we need to do perhaps a little bit of everything, or try to. So capture as much as possible of the sense, the meaning and the metaphors, as much as possible of the sounds and the rhymes, but also try to mimic that structure and to have that suspense that or tension perhaps that the German poem has. Hopefully that will lead to the same emotional impact, but you can be the judge of that. Okay, how would we go about finding rhymes to go in our poem? Now this is perhaps a difficult but I think really fun part of the poem. You might want to get a big piece of paper, do a big spider diagram and just throw down as many rhymes that you can think of, as many words which would somehow fit into the story or the sort of imagery of this poem. So I wrote down loads of words, and these are just a few of them. So I started with inside, and then because we've got a V, I thought, oh, woe betide, even though I wasn't sure how I would use that in the poem. Beside, well, there's nothing in the poem suggesting beside, is there? But it might be useful, we might need to change something slightly. Skies, that could work for Himmel. Blithe, perhaps for Sorglosen. And then I wasn't sure how this would fit with the structure, but I threw down rose, which later could rhyme with flow. The days grow longer, the days close. What if we didn't use the word rose, but instead had bloom? Then that could rhyme with room and soon. And then we need to have something to do with the dream. Well, perhaps stream instead of flow. Seam. Summer, though it's not a rhyme, it has at least got alliteration there, the m is echoed. So there's a few ideas that we could play around with and try to fit the structure of the poem around those words, perhaps.